Since February 24th, 2022, when Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation, the West has walked a fine line in Ukraine. While it works to help Ukraine push back the Russian invasion, Western countries are also carefully calculating their aid to avoid getting pulled into a direct conflict with a nuclear-armed adversary. The Wall Street Journal examined Western military aid over the first year of the Russia-Ukraine war to see what's next. The war over the last year can be broken into 3 phases.
Initially, the Ukrainians were looking for almost anything. I mean, one thing they requested early on, which didn't happen, was that the US and NATO impose a no-fly zone over Ukrainian airspace.
That was a red line the West didn't want to cross, and still hasn't. But they were providing other gear.
I'd say the first phase with the sort of insurgency phase and the anti-tank weapons, small arms and essentially meant for, what were likely to be partisan warfare.
A few days after the invasion, Germany announced it would send Ukraine anti-tank weapons and Stinger missiles, a stark difference from its previous legislation banning the delivery of arms to conflict regions. And in March, Germany also added 2,700 anti-aircraft missiles to that list. By the end of the month, officials of the Ukrainian army were touting wins. Russian forces began pulling back from Kyiv and Chernihiv. By Wednesday, April 6th, that withdrawal was complete. But with a renewed Russian offensive in eastern Ukraine, the U.S. had announced another $800 million package of aid. In that package were M777 howitzers, artillery pieces that can provide long-range fire support from the rear. And as fighting shifted to an attempted all-out assault by Russian forces in the Donbas area, Ukrainian officials stressed the urgent need for even more sophisticated long-range weaponry. The U.S. responded, this time with advanced rocket systems like these that transitioned the war into a new phase. Ukraine also began securing this kind of high-mobility artillery rocket systems known as HIMARS, and multiple launch rocket systems similar to these, or MLRS. As the war passed 100 days, Russian forces were consolidating their position toward the south and east of the country, looking to expand their control to strategic cities like this one. The arrival of these HIMARS helped strengthen Kyiv's hand in these areas. But these types of new weapons came with a clear red line.
Attacking occupied territory is one thing, but we don't want you using our artillery systems to attack targets in Russia. And that's one reason why the US has been reluctant, in fact, hasn't delivered longer range artillery or longer range ammunition that could be used in the HIMARS because it doesn't want the Ukrainians to be attacking Russia.
To ensure this line and reduce the risk of a wider war with Moscow, the U.S. secretly modified the advanced HIMARS rocket launchers it gave Ukraine. The Pentagon declined to comment on the modifications, which U.S. officials said involved their hardware and software. By the 6th month of war in Ukraine, momentum tilted against Russia's favor, shown clearly with this drone strike on the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. Still, the U.S. announced another nearly $3 billion for Ukraine's defense, the biggest U.S. weapons assistance package thus far. Ukraine made advances throughout the fall, first in Kharkiv, then in Kherson. Russian forces pulled back from Kharkiv in September. Ukraine said it had retaken about 3,500 square miles of territory from Moscow forces in the region. This marked the biggest setback for Russia since it invaded Ukraine in February. And in November, Russia ordered the withdrawal of its troops from Kherson, the only regional Ukrainian capital it held. As winter set with cold weather and shorter days, both sides slowed down their war efforts. But in 2023, a renewed push for military aid ramped up. Tanks like these kicked off the most recent phase of military aid and marked a departure from previous policies.
Early on in the war, the thought of sending Western battle tanks would be sort of regarded as really being a very risky step and a step too far. Now, of course, they're about to go into the theater.
It began with the UK agreeing first to send Western battle tanks to Ukraine, followed by the US providing Abrams tanks like these, and Germany outlining plans to send Leopard tanks like these ones.
The Russians have massed large numbers of forces and pushed them into Ukraine, leading Western and Ukrainian analysts to expect a further Russian offensive because the Russians seem to be playing for time. You know, it seems like they want a long war. They're waiting for something to turn up in their favor.
While the tanks will increase the Ukrainians' combat power, that equipment is some ways off. And further constraints on Western aid loom as the war carries on.
Western supplies are not limitless. The ability of Western industry to kind of produce more equipment for their own armies to replace the equipment that's been sent to Ukraine, and also more for the Ukrainians themselves, it isn't limitless.
The US has committed around $47 billion in military aid to Ukraine, the most of any country, followed by the EU and the United Kingdom. The extent to which this aid can continue at the rate it has been doing recently is unknown at this point. And in a lengthy war, some Western backers of Ukraine worry that time may be on Russia's side.
I mean, it looks likely now that this is going to be a long war. The Russians are going to end up as sort of, suffering long-term damage. Their military has been absolutely decimated. The Ukrainians, of course, have lost so much. So neither side looks like it's going to come out of this war ahead.